Mike's boots crunched against the gravel path as he walked deeper into the forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the tall trees. He liked the quiet. It was one of the few things that helped him forget the chaos of his past. A retired soldier, Mike had seen more battles than he cared to remember. But here, in the middle of nowhere, he could finally breathe. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the weight of his supplies. This was his routine, a few days in the wilderness to clear his mind. But this time, something felt different. The forest was unusually still, as if the animals were holding their breath. Mike stopped and listened. Nothing. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. And then it happened. A deafening roar split the air, followed by a blinding flash of light streaking across the sky. Mike shielded his eyes and instinctively ducked. The light was moving fast, heading toward the far side of the forest. A second later, the ground shook with a massive impact. Birds exploded from the trees, squawking in alarm. What the hell was that? Mike muttered to himself, his heart pounding. He hesitated. Years of military training had taught him to avoid danger, not run toward it. But curiosity burned in his chest. Whatever had just crashed was no ordinary meteor. Mike adjusted his cap and started moving toward the smoke rising in the distance. As he approached, the air grew thick with the smell of burnt wood and something else, something metallic and strange. The trees thinned out, and he found himself on the edge of a smoldering crater. In the center was a sleek, silver object half buried in the dirt. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, with glowing blue lines running along its surface. Mike's stomach tightened. This was no ordinary crash. He slid down the edge of the crater, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The object hissed and popped as it cooled. Mike kept his distance, scanning the area for signs of danger. That's when he saw it, a figure slumped against the side of the wreckage. It wasn't human. The creature was tall and slender, with pale, almost translucent skin that shimmered faintly in the fading light. Its large, almond-shaped eyes were closed, and its chest rose and fell weakly. It wore a tight, dark suit that seemed to blend into its body. Mike froze. His mind raced. Was this an alien? He'd seen plenty of strange things in his time, but nothing like this. He didn't know whether to run, call for help, or help it himself. Before he could decide, the creature stirred. Its eyes snapped open, and they locked onto Mike. The gaze was intense, filled with a mix of fear and defiance. The alien raised a trembling hand, and suddenly a small glowing device appeared in its grip. It pointed the device at Mike. Mike raised his hand slowly, his voice calm but firm. Easy. I'm not here to hurt you. The alien didn't lower the device. Instead, it spoke, words that sounded like a mix of whispers and static. Mike couldn't understand a thing, but the tone was clear. It didn't trust him. All right, Mike said, taking a small step back. You're hurt. I can help you, but you've got to put that thing down. The alien's gaze wavered, and for a moment, Mike thought it might listen. But then, a new sound reached his ears, a faint, high-pitched whine. The alien's eyes widened in panic. It spoke again, this time more urgently, and pointed toward the trees. Mike turned, scanning the shadows. He couldn't see anything, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was out there. What's coming? He asked, his voice low. The alien didn't answer, but the fear in its eyes said enough. The whine grew louder, and Mike realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration, faint but growing stronger. He turned back to the alien. All right, he said, more forcefully this time. You're coming with me. Whatever's out there, we're not waiting around to find out. The alien hesitated, its expression torn. Finally, it lowered the glowing device and let out a pained sound, almost like a sigh. Mike took that as a yes. He moved quickly, slinging his backpack off and pulling out a small first aid kit. He didn't know much about alien biology, but he knew enough to spot a bad wound. One of the alien's legs was bleeding, a thick, dark liquid oozing from a gash. Mike tore a strip of fabric from his shirt and wrapped it tightly around the wound. "This is gonna hurt," he warned, but the alien didn't flinch. The whine was almost deafening now, and Mike could see faint, glowing shapes moving through the trees. He didn't wait to find out what they were. He grabbed the alien's arm, pulling it to its feet. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. The alien stumbled but managed to keep up as Mike led them away from the crash site. Behind them, the glowing shapes emerged, hovering just above the ground. They were small, spherical machines with sharp metallic edges. Drones, Mike realized, and they didn't look friendly. As he and the alien disappeared into the forest, Mike's mind raced with questions. Who was this creature? Why had it crashed here? And most importantly, who, or what, was chasing them? The answers would have to wait. Right now, survival was all that mattered. The language barrier. Mike's breath came in short bursts as he pushed through the dense undergrowth, supporting the injured alien. The sound of mechanical drones hummed faintly behind them, growing louder with each passing second. He couldn't afford to slow down. The forest, with its maze of trees and uneven terrain, was their only shield. The alien stumbled again, nearly pulling them both down. "Hey, stay with me," Mike whispered sharply, gripping its arm tighter. The creature's large eyes looked up at him, clouded with exhaustion and pain. Its pale skin glowed faintly under the moonlight, making it look both otherworldly and fragile. They reached a small clearing where the ground dipped into a natural hollow. Mike scanned the area quickly, his soldier's instincts kicking in. This would have to do for now. He gently lowered the alien onto the soft earth and knelt beside it. "All right, we need to figure out how bad it is," he muttered, pulling out his flashlight and first aid kit. He wasn't even sure if human medicine would work, but he had to try. The alien winced as he carefully removed the makeshift bandage. The dark liquid oozing from its wound seemed thicker than blood, almost like oil, and it had a faint metallic sheen. Mike glanced at the alien's face. "Look, I don't know what you're saying, and I'm pretty sure you don't understand me. But I'm not gonna let you die out here. Got it?" The alien's gaze softened, and it nodded slightly. Then, with shaky hands, it reached for a small device on its belt. Mike tensed, unsure if it was another weapon, but the alien held it up to its throat and pressed a button. A faint mechanical hum filled the air, and then the alien spoke again. This time, the sounds were different, still garbled, but some words came through. "Danger, hunters, find us." Mike blinked. "You're translating? You can understand me now." The alien hesitated, then nodded. "Some words. Difficult. Your language strange." "Well, you're not exactly easy to understand either," Mike replied with a dry chuckle. The tension eased slightly, but the moment was short-lived as the faint drone sounds grew louder in the distance. "What's chasing you?" Mike asked, his tone serious again. "What are those things?" The alien's eyes darkened. "Hunters. Machines. Built to capture me." "Why you?" Mike pressed, keeping his voice low. "What did you do?" The alien hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I ran. Escaped. Have something they want." Mike frowned. "What is it?" "Some kind of weapon." The alien shook its head weakly. "Not weapon. Knowledge. Dangerous if wrong hands." Mike exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Great. So you're telling me those things are after you because you're carrying something that could start a war?" The alien didn't answer, but the look in its eyes told him enough. Before Mike could ask more questions, the alien's head drooped, and its breathing became shallow. "Hey, stay awake," he said, shaking its shoulder gently. "You can't pass out on me now." The alien's voice was barely a whisper. "Need. Rest. You. Protect." Mike gritted his teeth, Protecting people was second nature to him, but this. He had no backup, no plan, and no idea how to deal with alien technology. Still, he couldn't walk away. Not now. He reached for his backpack and pulled out a small bottle of water. "Here, drink this," he said, holding it to the alien's lips. It hesitated, then took a few sips, its expression softening in gratitude. The translator device crackled again. "Why? Help me?" Mike paused, caught off guard by the question. "Why wouldn't I?" He replied after a moment. "You're hurt, you're alone, and you're being hunted. I've been there. I know what it's like." The alien studied him, as if trying to understand the meaning behind his words. Then, slowly, it nodded. "Thank you." The faint hum of the drones grew louder, snapping Mike back to reality. He stood up, scanning the trees. The glowing orbs of the drones were now visible through the branches, weaving methodically as they searched. "All right," he said, turning back to the alien. "We've got to move. Can you stand?" The alien struggled to its feet, leaning heavily on Mike for support. Together, they started moving again, keeping to the shadows. The forest seemed endless, each step more grueling than the last. The sound of the drones never faded, a constant reminder that they were being hunted. As they pushed forward, the alien's translator crackled again. "Why? Forest? Why? Alone?" Mike hesitated, then shrugged. "It's a long story. Let's just say I've seen enough of people for a lifetime. Out here, it's quiet. No noise, no chaos. Just peace." The alien tilted its head, as if considering his words. "But you came. You help." Mike glanced at it, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, well, maybe I'm not as antisocial as I thought." They continued in silence, the bond between them growing stronger with every step. Despite the danger, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that this was the start of something bigger, something that would change his life forever. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The alliance. The night deepened, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The distant hum of the drones was a constant reminder that the hunters were not far behind. Mike and the alien, who he had learned was named Styra, moved as quickly as they could through the dense undergrowth. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, made Mike's pulse quicken. They were running out of time. Finally, they came to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a shallow ravine. The terrain here was more rugged, harder for the drones to navigate. Mike knew this was as good a place as any to regroup and come up with a plan. He guided Zyra to a sheltered spot under the rocks and knelt down, his flashlight illuminating her pale, sweat-covered face. "You're not looking so good," Mike said, digging into his backpack for a bottle of water. "Drink this. You're going to need your strength." Zyra took the bottle with trembling hands, her alien fingers oddly delicate. She drank slowly, her large, almond-shaped eyes scanning the forest with a mix of fear and determination. The translator device on her belt crackled faintly. "Danger. Closer. Not safe." Mike nodded grimly. "Yeah, I figured as much. But running blind isn't going to get us anywhere. We need a plan." Zyra tilted her head, her glowing skin dimming slightly as if she were considering his words. "Plan, you have?" she asked through the translator. Mike sighed, leaning back against the rock. "I've been making this up as I go, to be honest. But if those drones are tracking us, then we need to find a way to throw them off. A decoy, maybe." "Decoy," Tyra repeated, clearly unfamiliar with the term. "A distraction," Mike explained. "Something to make them think we're somewhere we're not." Zyra's gaze sharpened, and she seemed to consider his idea. Slowly, she reached into a small compartment on her suit and pulled out a cylindrical device. It was sleek and metallic, with faint blue lines running along its surface. She held it out to Mike. "What's this?" he asked, taking the device cautiously. "Beacon," Tyra said. "Emit, signal." They follow. Mike's eyebrows raised. You had this the whole time. Why didn't you use it earlier? Beacon, dangerous, Kyra said, her voice tinged with regret. Signal strong. They come fast. Mike stared at the device, turning it over in his hands. It was lightweight but felt oddly warm, almost alive. If what Kyra said was true, then activating it would draw the drones straight to them, or wherever they placed it. He looked back at Kyra, who was watching him with a mix of hope and fear. All right, he said, nodding. This could work, but we'll need to be smart about it. We'll set the beacon somewhere far enough away to buy us some time, then find a place to hide. Kyra nodded, though her expression remained tense. You lead. I follow. Mike couldn't help but smirk. Glad to see you're finally starting to trust me. As they prepared to move, Mike noticed Kyra's movements were slower, more labored. Her injury was worse than he thought, and the trek through the forest was taking its toll. He knelt down and motioned for her to climb onto his back. Come on, he said. You're not going to make it far like this. Kyra hesitated, clearly unused to relying on others, but eventually relented. As she climbed onto his back, Mike was struck by how light she was, almost unnaturally so. It was like carrying a shadow. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. The hum of the drones was growing louder, their glowing forms darting through the trees like mechanical predators. Mike's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been in worse situations before, or so he told himself. Finally, they'd reached a small clearing with a fallen tree at its center. Mike set Kyra down gently and held up the beacon. This is where we'll plant it, he said. Once it's active, we'll double back and find a place to hide. Kyra nodded, her eyes flicking nervously between the beacon and the dark forest. Mike placed the device on the ground and pressed the small button at its base. Instantly, the blue lines on its surface flared to life, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the clearing. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. We need to move, Mike said, grabbing Kyra's arm. They hurried back into the forest, keeping low and sticking to the underbrush. Behind them, the beacon's hum grew louder, and the faint sound of the drones shifted, their mechanical whine moving toward the clearing. Mike and Kyra didn't stop until they found a dense thicket of trees near the edge of the ravine. The overgrowth provided decent cover, and the sound of a nearby stream helped mask their presence. They crouched low, breathing heavily, as they listened to the drones converging on the beacon's location. It's working, Mike whispered, glancing at Kyra. They've taken the bait. Kyra's expression softened, and for the first time since they met, she seemed to relax. You, good leader, she said through the translator. Mike chuckled softly. Don't get used to it. This was the easy part. As the sound of the drones faded into the distance, Mike leaned back against a tree and exhaled. They had bought themselves some time, but the danger was far from over. The hunters weren't going to stop until they found Kyra. And now, Mike was part of the fight. Looking at Kyra, who was watching him with quiet gratitude, Mike felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. And he wasn't about to give up now. The first attack. The forest felt alive with tension, every shadow holding the possibility of danger. Mike crouched low behind a fallen tree, his hand resting lightly on Kyra's shoulder to keep her steady. Her breathing was shallow, her glowing skin flickering faintly as her energy waned. She was running on empty, but they couldn't stop now. The sound of the drones was growing louder again. The beacon had worked, but not for long. These hunters were relentless, and now they were sweeping the area with more precision. Mike glanced up at the thick canopy of trees, their twisted branches barely concealing the faint blue glow of the drones darting overhead. They're too close, Mike muttered, more to himself than Kyra. His mind raced. In the military, he'd faced ambushes, firefights, and impossible odds, but this was something else entirely. These weren't human enemies. They were machines, programmed to hunt and kill with cold efficiency. Zira shifted beside him, her hand gripping the translator device. They adapt, she said in a strained voice. Learn from failure. Stronger now. Mike frowned. Stronger? Great, just what we need. He scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking out potential escape routes, but none looked promising. The terrain was uneven, and the dense undergrowth would slow them down. If they ran now, they'd be caught within minutes. A sudden mechanical whirring sound snapped Mike's attention back to the sky. One of the drones had stopped, hovering unnaturally still above their position. Its glowing core pulsed faintly, and a thin beam of blue light swept the forest floor. Mike's stomach sank. It's scanning, he whispered. He looked at Zaira. Can they detect heat? Zaira nodded weakly. Yes. They see energy. Life. Mike cursed under his breath. The thick forest might hide them from sight, but it wouldn't matter if the drones could sense their body heat. He glanced at the stream they had passed earlier, an idea forming in his mind. All right, listen, he said, his voice firm but calm. We need to get to that stream. The water might mask our heat signatures long enough for them to lose us. Zaira hesitated, her eyes darting to the glowing drone above. Too risky. We don't have a choice, Mike said. He reached for her arm, helping her to her feet. Stay close to me. And whatever you do, don't stop running. Zaira nodded, her fear giving way to determination. Together, they moved swiftly but quietly, keeping low as they made their way toward the stream. The sound of rushing water grew louder, a faint beacon of hope in the oppressive silence of the forest. But hope was short-lived. A loud metallic screech echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the undergrowth. Mike turned, his heart sinking as he saw one of the drones descending rapidly, its glowing core flaring bright blue. It had found them. Go, he shouted, pushing Zaira ahead. She stumbled but kept moving, her long legs surprisingly quick despite her injuries. Mike spun around, his eyes narrowing as the drone closed in. It was unlike anything he'd seen before, sleek and deadly, its sharp edges glinting in the moonlight. The drone emitted a loud, piercing sound, and a small compartment on its side opened. A thin, metallic arm emerged, tipped with what looked like a weapon. Mike didn't wait to find out what it could do. He grabbed a large branch from the ground and hurled it with all his strength. The branch struck the drone, causing it to veer slightly off course, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Damn thing's tougher than it looks, Mike muttered, already moving again. The stream was just ahead, its cold water glinting faintly under the moonlight. Zaira had already reached it, wading in up to her knees. She turned, her eyes wide as she saw the drone closing in on Mike. Mike, she shouted, her voice trembling. I'm fine. He yelled back, diving into the water just as a bright blue beam shot past him, scorching the ground where he'd stood moments before. The water was freezing, but Mike barely noticed. He crawled forward, pulling himself deeper into the stream, until only his head and shoulders were above the surface. The drone hovered above the water, its beam scanning the area. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, its glowing core dimming slightly. Mike held his breath, his eyes locked on the machine. It wasn't moving. Did the water actually work? Zaira's voice broke through the silence. Behind you. Mike turned just in time to see another drone emerging from the trees, its mechanical limbs unfolding as it prepared to attack. He had no weapons, no backup, and no time to think. Acting purely on instinct, he grabbed a fist-sized rock from the stream and hurled it at the drone. The rock struck the glowing core, and sparks flew as the machine shuddered and faltered. Not so tough now, are you? Mike muttered, but his relief was short-lived. The first drone had recovered, and was now aiming directly at him. Before it could fire, a high-pitched sound cut through the air, followed by a blinding flash of blue light. Mike shielded his eyes, and when he looked again, the drone was falling, its core flickering before it crashed into the water. He turned to see Xyra holding a small glowing device, some kind of alien weapon. "You had that the whole time?" Mike asked, his tone half angry, half relieved. Xyra managed a faint smile. "Last resort. Not strong." Mike shook his head, but there was no time to argue. The sound of more drones approaching filled the air. He grabbed Xyra's arm, pulling her deeper into the forest. "This isn't over," he said, his voice grim. "Not by a long shot." As they disappeared into the shadows, Mike couldn't help but feel a strange sense of resolve. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and running for their lives. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not ever. The sacrifice. The forest had grown darker, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. Mike and Xyra trudged onward, their breaths ragged, their bodies worn from the relentless chase. The stream had bought them some time, but not enough. The sound of the drones was fainter now, but it was still there, an ever-present reminder that the hunters wouldn't stop. Xyra stumbled again, her legs giving out beneath her. Mike caught her just in time, easing her down onto a mossy patch of ground. Her glow had dimmed even more, her energy clearly drained. "You can't keep going like this," Mike said, his voice tinged with frustration and worry. "You're running on fumes." Xyra shook her head weakly. "No choice. Must keep moving." Mike knelt beside her, his brow furrowed. He rummaged through his backpack, looking for anything that could help. A few protein bars, some water, a basic first aid kit, nothing that could fix whatever was wrong with her. "This isn't just about your leg, is it?" he asked, his tone softening. Xyra hesitated, then pressed a hand to her chest, just above where her heart would be if she were human. "Energy core. Failing," she said through the translator. "Too much damage. Not enough power." Mike exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He didn't fully understand what she was talking about, but the message was clear. She was dying. Before he could respond, the faint hum of the drones grew louder. Mike's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the shadows. They were getting closer. Too close. "We have to move," he said, his voice firm. He reached down to help Xyra up, but she resisted, her pale hand gripping his wrist. "No," she said, her voice stronger than before. "You go. Leave me." Mike froze, staring at her in disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? I'm not leaving you." Xyra's eyes met his, filled with a strange mix of sadness and determination. "I slow you down. If I stay, they follow me. You escape." Mike shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Not a chance. We've come this far together. I'm not about to throw in the towel now." "Towel?" Xyra repeated, confused. "It's an expression," Mike said, his voice softening despite the situation. "It means I'm not giving up on you." Xyra's expression faltered, and for a moment, she looked almost human. "You, strange," she said. "Humans, strange." Mike managed a faint smile. "Yeah, well, you're not exactly normal yourself." The moment of levity was short-lived. The hum of the drones was louder now, accompanied by the faint glow of their cores cutting through the trees. They didn't have much time. Xyra reached into a compartment on her suit and pulled out a small crystalline device. It pulsed faintly, emitting a soft blue light. She held it out to Mike. "What's this?" he asked, taking the device. "Data core," Xyra said. "Everything they want. Knowledge. Dangerous. Must stay safe." Mike's stomach sank. "You're telling me that this is what they've been after? This little thing?" Xyra nodded. "If they get it, many will die." Mike stared at the device, his mind reeling. This wasn't just about her. It was bigger than that. Bigger than him. He looked back at Syra, who was watching him with a pleading expression. "You take it," she said. "Run. Hide. Protect." Mike shook his head again. "I'm not running, and I'm not leaving you here to die." Syra's expression hardened. "If you stay, both die. Mission fails." The words hit Mike like a punch to the gut. He had faced death before, but this was different. This wasn't about a mission or orders. It was about doing the right thing. And yet he couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. "I've lost people before," he said, his voice low. "Good people. People I should have been able to save. I'm not losing anyone else, you hear me?" Syra's gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension between them melted away. "You, brave," she said, "but stubborn." Mike smirked. "You're just figuring that out now." The drones were close now, their glowing cores visible through the trees. Mike could feel the vibrations in the ground, the faint hum growing into a menacing buzz. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "If we're doing this, we're doing it together." Syra's eyes widened. "Together?" Mike nodded, slipping the data core into his pocket. "Yeah, you're not getting rid of me that easily." Before Syra could protest, Mike grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, but he steadied her, his grip firm. "We'll draw them away," he said, already scanning the area for options. "Find a place to hide. Then we figure out our next move." Syra hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Together." The first drone broke through the trees, its core glowing bright blue as it locked onto them. Mike's heart pounded, but he didn't hesitate. Grabbing a rock from the ground, he hurled it at the drone, hitting its core dead center. Sparks flew, and the machine faltered. "Come on," he shouted, pulling Syra along as they ran deeper into the forest. The sound of the drones grew louder, but Mike didn't look back. He had made his choice. He wasn't leaving Syra behind. Not now. Not ever. They would face whatever came next together. The plan. Mike and Syra stumbled through the dense forest, the glow of the drones lighting up the darkness behind them. Every step was harder than the last, with Syra leaning heavily on Mike for support. His muscles burned, but he refused to stop. They couldn't afford to. They reached a small clearing near a rocky cliff. The terrain was rough, with jagged boulders and a steep drop on one side. Mike scanned the area quickly. The rocks and narrow paths could work in their favor, if they played it right. "We need to make a stand here," Mike said, setting Syra down against a boulder. "This place gives us some cover, and we can funnel them into a choke point." Syra's breathing was shallow, her glow dimmer than ever. "Stand. Here. They. Too many." Mike crouched in front of her, his face set with determination. "We don't have a choice. If we keep running, they'll catch us eventually. This is the only chance we've got." Syra hesitated, her large, luminous eyes searching his face. "You? Plan." Mike nodded, already pulling items from his backpack. He laid out a flashlight, a coil of rope, and a small multi-tool. It wasn't much, but years of military experience had taught him how to make do with what he had. "I'm going to set up some traps," he explained. "Tripwires, distractions, anything to slow them down. If we can force them into this narrow path by the cliff, we might have a shot at taking a few of them out." Syra tilted her head, her translator crackling faintly. "You? Fight machines. With these?" Mike smirked, shaking his head. "You'd be surprised what a little ingenuity can do." He glanced at the weapon she had used earlier, the small glowing device she had called a last resort. It was still in her hand, its faint light barely visible. "What about that thing?" he asked, nodding toward it. "Can it take down more of them?" Syra looked down at the weapon, her expression grim. "Low power, few shots left. Must use carefully." Mike exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "All right, we'll save it for when things get really bad." He stood up, rolling his shoulders and grabbing the rope. "You stay here and rest. I'll handle the traps." "No," Kyra said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I help. Together." Mike hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead." Setting the traps. The next hour passed in tense silence as Mike and Kyra worked quickly to prepare the area. Mike used the rope to set up crude tripwires between the boulders, tying them low enough to catch the drones if they moved too fast. He placed the flashlight on a rock, pointing it toward the narrow path by the cliff. When turned on, it would create a bright, disorienting light that might throw off the machine's sensors. Kyra, despite her weakened state, used her limited energy to modify the small crystalline device she had given Mike earlier. She explained that it could emit a pulse strong enough to temporarily disable the drones, but only within a very small radius. "This only work once," she said, handing it back to Mike. "You use wisely." Mike took the device, nodding. "We'll save it for when they're right on top of us." With everything in place, they retreated to a small alcove in the rocks, hidden from view, but with a clear line of sight to the path. The sound of the drones was closer now, their mechanical hum vibrating through the air. Mike leaned back against the rock, his breath steady but his mind racing. He glanced at Kyra, who was slumped beside him, her eyes half closed. "You holding up?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "You, not leave." "Could have, but stayed." Mike gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, I've got a thing about leaving people behind. Call it a flaw." "Not flaw," Kyra said softly. "Honor." Mike looked at her, surprised by the weight of the word. He nodded, his expression serious. "Honor. Yeah, something like that." The hunters arrive. The first drone appeared at the edge of the clearing, its glowing core casting an eerie light across the rocks. It hovered for a moment, scanning the area, before moving forward cautiously. Behind it, more drones emerge, sleek, metallic shapes gliding through the air like predators. Mike tensed, his hand gripping the crystalline device. "Here we go," he muttered. The lead drone hit the first tripwire, jerking violently as the rope caught on its lower limbs. It spun erratically, colliding with the rock face and exploding in a shower of sparks. The noise seemed to alert the others, and they advanced more quickly, their glowing cores pulsing with a menacing light. Mike flipped on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and striking the nearest drone. The light seemed to disorient it, its movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. Kyra, with what little strength she had left, raised her weapon and fired. A burst of blue energy struck the drone, sending it crashing to the ground. "Two down," Mike said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Let's keep it up." But the remaining drones were learning. They avoided the tripwires, moving in a coordinated formation toward the alcove. One of them fired a thin blue beam that narrowly missed Mike's head, scorching the rock behind him. "Time for the pulse," Mike said, holding up the crystalline device. He waited until the drones were within range, then activated it. A wave of blue light erupted from the device, washing over the clearing. The drones froze, their cores flickering as the pulse disrupted their systems. Two of them fell to the ground, lifeless. Mike turned to Kyra, his voice urgent. "That's all I've got. What about you?" Kyra held up her weapon, its glow faint. "One shot left." The final drone recovered quickly, its core flaring brightly as it targeted them. Mike and Kyra exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. "Make it count," Mike said. Kyra nodded, raising the weapon with trembling hands. The drone fired first, its beam striking the rock inches from Mike's head. Kyra fired back, the blue energy striking the drone's core dead center. The machine exploded, the blast echoing through the forest. Aftermath. The silence that followed was deafening. Mike and Kyra sat slumped against the rocks, their bodies battered but alive. The clearing was littered with the remains of the drones, their glowing cores dim and lifeless. "You did it," Mike said, looking at Syra. "We did it," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, Mike allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, but they had survived. And as he looked at Syra, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't in this alone anymore. The last stand. The forest was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. The shattered remains of drones lay scattered around the rocky clearing, their once menacing cores now dark and lifeless. The air smelled of scorched metal and burnt earth. Mike leaned against a jagged boulder, his chest heaving, every muscle in his body screaming in exhaustion. Beside him, Syra sat slumped, her glow so faint it was barely visible. "We can't stay here," Mike said, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, his throat dry. "There's more of them out there. This was just a scouting party." Syra nodded weakly, her luminous eyes meeting his. "Yes, more will come. They always come." Mike pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady but determined. He reached down to help Syra up, his hand gripping hers firmly. "Then we finish this," he said. "No more running, no more hiding. We take the fight to them." Syra looked at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. "You? Sure. Dangerous." Mike smirked faintly. "Dangerous is kind of my thing." The final plan. They moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow paths and steep ravines that had kept them hidden so far. Syra, though weak, guided them with a precision that impressed Mike. She seemed to sense the drones' movements, avoiding their patrol routes with uncanny accuracy. After an hour of travel, they reached the edge of a massive clearing. In the center stood a sleek, metallic structure, tall, angular, and humming with a faint energy. It was the hunter's base, the hub where the remaining drones were stationed. Mike crouched low, studying the structure. "That's where they're controlling everything, isn't it?" Syra nodded. "Central core. Destroy it. Hunters fall." Mike frowned. "And how exactly do we destroy something like that? It's not like I have a rocket launcher in my back pocket." Syra hesitated, then reached into a compartment on her suit. She pulled out a small crystalline device, similar to the one they had used earlier, but larger and pulsing with a brighter light. "This," she said. "Energy bomb. Overloads. Destroys core." Mike raised an eyebrow. "That's convenient. What's the catch?" "Must. Place inside." Tahira said, her voice grave. "Close to core. Manual." Mike's stomach sank. "So someone has to go in there and plant it." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes. And no escape after." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Mike clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had faced death before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about Syra, about stopping the hunters, about saving countless lives. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." Syra's eyes widened. "No, you cannot. You, human, fragile." Mike chuckled dryly. "Gee, thanks for the vote of confidence. Look, you're in no shape to do this. And besides, you said it yourself. You're carrying knowledge that can't fall into the wrong hands. If you die, all of this was for nothing." Syra looked at him, her expression torn. "You, brave. Foolish, but brave." "Story of my life," Mike said with a smirk. "Now, let's get to work." Infiltration. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the base. Syra used what little energy she had left to hack into the hunter's systems, creating false signals and distractions to divert the drones. Mike moved with practiced precision, his military training kicking in as he navigated the maze-like structure. The interior of the base was cold and sterile, its walls glowing faintly with alien energy. The hum of machinery filled the air, accompanied by the occasional whir of a passing drone. Mike's heart pounded, but he stayed focused. He clutched the energy bomb tightly, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. Zyra guided him through the corridors, her voice coming through the translator device. Core. Ahead. Few guards. Careful. Careful's my middle name, Mike muttered, peeking around a corner. 2 drones hovered near the entrance to the central chamber, their glowing cores pulsing rhythmically. He glanced at Zyra. Any way to disable those quietly? Zyra hesitated, then held up her weapon. Last shot. Mike frowned but nodded. All right. Make it count. Zyra stepped forward, her hand steady despite her weakened state. She aimed carefully and fired. The blue energy bolt struck the nearest drone, causing it to shudder and collapse. The second drone turned, its core flaring as it prepared to attack. Mike didn't wait. He grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and hurled it at the drone with all his strength. The makeshift weapon struck the drone's core, disrupting its energy field long enough for Zyra to deliver a final blow. Nice teamwork, Mike said, flashing her a quick smile. Zyra managed a faint nod. Hurry. No time. The final sacrifice. They entered the central chamber, a massive circular room dominated by a towering energy core. The core pulsed with a blinding light, its power radiating through the entire structure. Mike could feel the heat from where he stood. This is it, he said, gripping the energy bomb tightly. He turned to Zyra. Get out of here. I'll finish this. No, Zyra said firmly. Not leave you. Mike sighed. Zyra, listen to me. You're the only one who can carry on after this. You have the knowledge, the technology. You can help others, but only if you survive. Zyra hesitated, her expression conflicted. Finally, she placed a hand on his shoulder. You, good human. Better than most. Mike chuckled softly. Don't make me blush. With that, he turned and ran toward the core. The heat was intense, sweat pouring down his face as he approached the central console. He placed the energy bomb against the base of the core, activating its timer. The device began to pulse, its light growing brighter with each passing second. The drones swarmed into the room, their cores flaring as they targeted him. Mike grabbed a fallen piece of metal and swung it wildly, buying Zyra time to escape. The last thing he saw was her figure disappearing through the doorway, her faint glow a beacon of hope. The aftermath. The explosion was blinding, a wave of energy that consumed the base and everything inside it. The forest trembled, the sky lighting up as the hunter's network collapsed. Far from the destruction, Zyra stood on a hill, her eyes fixed on the distant glow. She clutched the translator device in her hand, her expression unreadable. You did it, she whispered. You saved us. The forest fell silent, the hunters defeated. But for Zyra, the victory was bittersweet. She turned and walked into the darkness, carrying Mike's sacrifice and his legacy with her.